Hola, bienvenidos a todos.
Hola a todos.
Hola.
Welcome to our next episode of BilingLutes, our next installment of our series with me and Adela. And we have two wonderful guests today. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Adela.
Thanks, Luke. Gracias. Bienvenidos a todos. Estamos súper emocionados. Today we have two awesome guests, and I'm going to introduce one of them, Giovanna Urdangarain, who's one of my favorite people, not just at PLU, but in the world. She is Associate Professor, yes, indeed, Associate Professor of Hispanic Studies at PLU. She is one of the co-founders of PLU for Us, the Task Force for Undocumented Students. And in her scholarship and teaching, she focuses on Southern Corn literature. That sounded like Southern corn, but it's actually Southern cone. Feminist readings of Southern corn and dictatorship literature, trauma, memory, women writers, and much more. But I'd like you to hear about her from her own voice. So Giovanna, ¿qué nos puedes contar de ti?
Bueno, hola, buenas tardes. Thank you so much for having me and also Jacob. Good to see you after a few years. I'm very excited to be here. I think this is a wonderful initiative by you and Luke. So thanks for thinking of doing this. As you said, I've been here at PLU since 2008, and I do teach language classes, culture classes, and literature classes in the Hispanic Studies and Latino Studies program. Now we have a new Latino Studies minor starting in the fall that was developed by my colleague, Dr. Emily Davidson. And so students interested in that would be able to focus their studies on that area. I work on not very uplifting topics in my scholarship, but that doesn't mean I don't have hope in what I do. But yes, I have mostly research on issues that have to do with pain and how do we represent that pain, both in literature and in film. And mostly in the beginning of my scholarship, I work mostly on women's issues and how issues of social violence, sexual violence have been represented in those areas. But I enjoy teaching all my classes, language classes, culture classes, and I've had also lucky to be able to teach in the former Women and Gender Studies program, now Gender, Sexuality, and Race program started in the fall as well. And I'm also an affiliate to the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. So I think that sums up what I've been doing in these last 11 years at PLU, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Yeah, no, I think you really highlight the amazing array of not only your interests and your expertise, but also the many programs our students can engaging at PLU on really, really important topics, which, as you say, sometimes are not particularly joyful, but they are incredibly important. So thank you so much, Giovanna. Luke?
Awesome. Yes, and so we have another guest here as well. Jacob Taylor-Mosquera, a 2009 PLU alum in the house today. Born in Cali, Colombia, and raised in Gig Harbor, just across the bridge from PLU. At PLU, he majored in Hispanic Studies and Global Studies. So, bienvenido, Jacob. Cuéntanos un poco más de ti.
Listo. Gracias, Luke. Gracias, Adela. Gracias, Profe. No, it's a great, really pleasure to be here with you all virtually. And with you all at home as well. Like Luke said, I was born in Colombia, in Cali, adopted and raised here in the Pacific Northwest in Gig Harbor, which we can talk about later. And I was at PLU. I said it out loud, 2009 sounds so far away, but it's great to be here. I currently teach up in Seattle at a small liberal private school called University Prep. I teach Spanish there. Come full circle. And I teach also at Seattle Central College, Spanish there as well, and at Casa Latina, also in Seattle, and also Spanish for adults. So I'm just really into Spanish for now. I will be stepping away from teaching secondary ed hopefully next year, trying to move into public administration. So I started a program at Seattle University for that in the fall, and then hopefully be able to transfer into a different world this time next year. We'll see. But yeah, super excited to be here, and this topic is essential, not only for the moment we're living in right now on an international level, but also just it needs to be talked about more. So I applaud the effort of you, Luke, and Adela for bringing this up. This is tremendous. So thank you for allowing us to have this space.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that education in action. You hear that, y'all?
Absolutely.
Doing big things.
Yeah, and I want to also shout out to Kenzie Gandhi, who proposed the topic Black Joy, and that led us to think about Afro-Latinx identities and communities. So definitely, I think highlighting the commitment of the university to really exploring these urgent, as you're saying, Jacob, topics.
Yeah.
So let's get started.
I think so, yeah. So when we were discussing, this is another important topic that we wanted to unpack a little bit. So before we get into our big segment, we wanted to ask our guest, how would you explain the X in Latinx? And we were chatting a little bit earlier, we were saying, I remember a couple years back when the @ symbol, for those of you who remember, the @ symbol was incorporated in Latino, Latina, and then now we're seeing more of the Latinx come into our into vocabulary and into our written documents. So yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it to Giovanna if you want to tell us a little bit about like how do you see the X show up, or like what does that X mean for you?
The X is it's an inclusive marker of differences in gender and identities. So I would say the most inclusive way to use a plural form in Spanish. The @ was received, I think, less enthusiastically in Latin America, just because people were wondering how you pronounce that. And the same thing has been said about the X in the context of Spanish speaking countries. So as I was mentioning before, my experience with the inclusive marker in South America has been to use the E. So instead of saying todas y todos, using todes. And then including that in all the plurals. So I find myself really writing with the X in the US, and if I'm communicating with friends in South America, using the E. But at the same time, I have to say, it's interesting to have the conversation about this with students who are learning Spanish for the first time, because it's not realistic right now for them to believe that everybody's using the inclusive marker when they travel and go to those countries. So, I mean, it always prompts these very rich conversations with students about, this is what young people and progressive groups of people in all the Spanish-speaking countries are using, and it's becoming more popular, and for a very good reason. But you are going to run into many people who are not even aware of those markers still in some countries. So yes, so the X for me the most inclusive way to speak here in the US, and the E is what I use in Latin America.
I think that's a really great distinction, that it's a US kind of based word or suffix. Yeah, I'm trying to go back to my prefix and suffix, but trying to understand, what does that look like and how do you even say it? I've had conversations with family members of like, what's going on here? How do we have to put everything, Do you have any X?
Yeah.
So trying to understand where that comes from.
Right. Yeah, and if I can say something very brief, I don't want to take time from you, Jake, is that sometimes I've seen also funny, that we use gendered nouns when we refer to objects, right? So I would say there's no need to make, a feminine noun as chair, la silla, into an inclusive chair, because they are not human beings. So, but I've seen that being used also. So that's also important.
It would be an endless task. I would.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. it makes me super quickly just, it reminded me of how last week when Luke and I introduced ourselves for the first time, it was actually the first time I realized in that moment that I actually was saying my pronouns in Spanish. And that led me to really reflect for the last week. I've been thinking, why hadn't I? And that kind of speaks to your point, Giovanna, that you're teaching your students that they won't encounter these practices everywhere they go. And I think the reason why I haven't had to do it when I go home is because I'm in a family and friendship environment mainly, and I don't have to introduce myself in Spanish when I'm there. And so I hadn't had to do it. So it just kind of really underscores, it's very helpful to hear you explain it because it underscores my own experience of the pronoun as an institutionally rooted experience in the US in English so far, obviously not. So yeah, it's very interesting. But Jake, yeah, tell us what you have to.
Yeah, totally. No, I was listening to Giovanna speak and I shot right away to some memories from my 7th graders in the fall, pre-COVID, of course, conversations about, because we were doing definite articles and with the gender, and they're like, well, but what about for people who are transgender? What do we say for them? And I said, well, yeah, that's a discussion we're having with the French department as well, because we don't know. It's like you said, Giovanna, yes, I agree completely. More inclusive language, and it's necessary. I will also say, however, that when I go back to the barrio in Cali, these are not concepts that are even fathomable for people.
Yeah.
Right? These are still, and even I dance between very, very, very impoverished neighborhoods, like with my biological family in Cali and Tumaco. But then when I go even to academic circles, it's still not really something that's being used with a significant amount of frequency in at least in Southwest Colombia. Maybe in Bogota, Medellin, and Cartagena is different, but for the Southwest, it hasn't caught on yet. I can say I was just there in December, and I'll be there again, hopefully, in December as well. So I feel it's interesting that we jump right away to the word inclusivity, while also kind of maybe there's a tension there with the inclusivity being up here north of the Rio Grande, and then south, maybe, I don't know, of course I can't speak for all of Latin America, and I don't intend to, but for Southwest Colombia, I can say that it is not something that's present yet. If I go around to a different meetings down there, and I say, oh, mucho gusto, yo soy Jacob, y utilizo él, I'll be met with a sea of confused looks. Because again, it's just hasn't, these concepts and these conversations haven't taken place yet, haven't taken hold. If I talk about this conversation, which I will be tonight with my aunt, she's going to have a lot of questions about, well, why does it matter with putting an X or putting an A or putting, why can't we just keep things as they are, would be her response. And then of course we could, all 4 of us would be like, well, no, because this and this and this. And let's change, and let's change language, and let's change essentially the world. But it's tough. I don't feel any kind of malicious intent when I hear questions from cousins and nieces and nephews down there. It's strict curiosity, which is a good thing. But I guess I'll pause there, because I mean, this is a fantastic topic. And as a language teacher, it's something that's always on our minds, right? How do we be more inclusive in that setting? And then also preparing students for those inevitable trips abroad, or study abroad or work abroad. So it's a constant dance.
I was wanting to add that, thinking sometimes also about the students traveling then to Latin America, right, and Spanish-speaking contexts, having that conversations with them about not being a delay in evolution of any kind, because then there is always the risk of the student thinking, well, I come from the United States and we do use these terms because we are thinking about different identities. Well, it's not that people there are not doing it, it's just that, there are different historical situations explaining that. But language evolves so slowly, right? We do know that. way slower than societies itself. And then the oral language also takes much longer into becoming accepted and codified. So I agree with you, Jake. I know in Argentina and Chile, in Uruguay, which are the countries I'm more familiar with because I study and have many friends in those places, it's not everybody at all using the pronouns. But I have to say in Chile is way more predominant right now, and in Argentina, yeah. And I attribute that to the work of the feminist movement that has been so strong in Chile in the last couple of years. They've actually brought the agenda of, gender and inclusivity to a point that has been very influential in a very positive way to the rest of the region. Mm-hmm. But yeah, again, it's a small places, and as I was saying before, progressive groups, feminist groups, people doing activism, transgender communities. In the case of Uruguay, there is Ovejas Negras. It's an organization that works on transgender and LGBTQ issues, and they've been very proactive and influential in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Qué bien. Qué bien.
Yeah. And I think, this whole conversation really highlights and ties very neatly to kind of our bigger question about Afro-Latinx cultures and identities. Even the term Afro-Latino or Afro-Latina is relatively recent because the recovery of the history is also very recent. And so I'd be interested in you sharing kind of what you think audience members who are very new to the idea of Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latin American identities, what would be kind of the most important thing you'd like them to understand about these identities, like obviously in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, I think for me it's just to recognize the fact that there are millions of people of African descent in Central and South America and the Caribbean. That I can't tell you how many times I've been at parent night when students' parents are coming through, and I have my tie and I'm ready, I have my name tag, and I'm asked directly to my face, "Hey, so is the Spanish teacher coming?" Or and I'm like, "Right here, it says right here. I'm the Spanish teacher." And so, but up here in the Northwest, someone who looks like me I'm not the typical Spanish teacher up here. And in fact, I haven't seen an Afro-Latino Spanish teacher up here besides myself. Right? In New York or Miami, it's a different story. But here in the Northwest, I haven't seen one. I've seen everything else that comes to mind when we immediately think of Spanish teacher in this part of the country. So I just think for me, it starts there. It starts with people understanding that there are millions and millions and millions of Afro-Latinos in all over this hemisphere. And in fact, it's a historical fact, like African slaves or people from Africa who were enslaved were taken to Central and South America and the Caribbean in greater numbers than to this country. Massive, massive, massive scale. And so just starting there, that's what I want people to understand, is that yes, we're still the minority in these countries, but there is a significant, more than significant population. So that would be my starting off point, would be that. And also, even in countries like Mexico and like Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, we still have significant Black populations there as well. And so to not make these populations disappear would be my other plea, because and someone who was watching this right now might think, what do you mean there's Black people in Mexico? And I came across that when I was in Oaxaca, and people Mexican citizens would deny that there's even a Black population. Or when I was in Chile for my graduate research, that was a horrible experience for me personally, because of the racism and discrimination that I came across. And so, yeah, when we think about Afro-Latinx communities, one, I paused to think about, are we talking about Afro-Latinx communities here in the US, or are we thinking about the hemisphere as a whole, or strictly to Latin America and the Caribbean, or I don't know. But certainly to have the audience understand fully that the numbers are there, and people are still in some certain countries still fighting for a place on the census. And so just to get that basic recognition that, hey, we're here and we exist and we matter, to kind of echo the current currents, I guess you could say. Yeah, that's the big one for me.
I appreciate that. It speaks a lot to our bias, whether they're conscious or unconscious, and they really come out. And seeing who is the Spanish teacher, and like having the assumptions based on is somebody from Mexico, but like there's so many more other, like you said, millions of other people who speak Spanish on this earth that are qualified for positions to speak Spanish and be teachers and professors in the U.S. Yeah, thanks for sharing about that.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Con gusto.
Yeah, I would second everything that that Jake mentioned. I do remember you telling me about your experience, fortunate experience a few years ago back in Chile. It's definitely, if we think about, you know, the reflection upon Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, and how that also prompted discussions about racism towards Afro-Latin Americans all across the continent. And also here in the US, I had a chance to discuss with some students who were telling me, you know, what has been hard for us, and this was 2 weeks ago, is bringing this issue to our families and talking to our parents and sisters and aunts here in the US about that, because we are Latinx and we are also seeing many times that discrimination within the Latinx community. Obviously, it's such, as Jake was pointing out, it's such a, so if we talk about the reality of the Afro-Latin American identity in Latin America, or if we talk about that here in the US, we would have so many different things to discuss, right? My impression, and the first thing I'm thinking about when you ask that question, is that here I've heard always, if I identify, people saying, if I identify as Black, I'm not Latino enough. If I identify as Latinx, then I cannot establish that dialogue or that, you know, allegiance with people in the other group. So feeling that divide has been something traumatic for many individuals. And if you are not familiar with the poetry of Ariana Brown, and she's one of the people in Texas who's done such an amazing work with her word poetry and bringing those two identities together, and honestly denouncing the discrimination and the pain coming from both communities when they don't recognize her as part of both. So in the US, I've been here for many years now, but I remember still how surprised I was about how people would not realize that aside from the heterogeneous, the diversity of identities in Latin America, they would not know or have heard of people who were of African descent in Latin America. Even though there is still a large Dominican community, you know, in New Jersey, in the East Coast. Puerto Ricans have always been present in large numbers in the US. Cubans, I mean, we cannot talk about Cuba without talking about race as well. So yes, it's the recognition and the justice for basically human rights in regard to this community is happening now with the possibility of identify the way they should have been able to do for many, many years. And it's only happening now in the census. Mexico had that included just recently. Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile did it a few years ago. And if we think about Brazil, which is a country in Latin America that has the largest number of people of African descent, we know the racial justice there, it's still a work in progress and not very successful most of the time. So yeah, it's impossible to address all,
of course,
the realities, but when you suggested this topic, Adela, the other day, I immediately thought of something that I learned when I think it was late in life, and I had never heard of the real meaning of the term. And it's a term that comes from Africa, and it's quilombo. And quilombo is a term that was used to design the communities that people escaping from slavery formed, going to the forest and becoming autonomous and independent, and having this opportunity to live in community in a more just way. I'm not going to say 100% harmonious, because we know that is a romanticization of any historical period, but definitely escaping what was slavery and finding another way to be Africans in the new continent. And quilombo, in the part of the continent where I come from, and I grew up listening that word with a very negative meaning, because it referred to brothel, right? So the idea of saying quilombo meant prostitutes and a place to meet with prostitutes. That was the most popular meaning. It has switched in the last decade or so, and so now it's used still with a negative connotation, but it has moved away from sex, and it refers to lack of organization or chaos, or somebody wanted to create conflict, would be called a quilombero, when the term actually meant revolution, right? And it was resistance, and how that term became demonized to be something negative associated with that was illegal, that was punishable, that was had to be censored. It's beyond me. I'm not a linguist. I'm not sure about how that happened, but it's fascinating to see how we use language to punish people, and how we erase the history associated with some terms to make it something totally different.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. That really ties to the first question of like, where does Latinx come from, and the influence of language, and like, how do people receive language, and how does it evolve over time? I really appreciate that example too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting how much both what you, Giovanna, and Jake have just shared is really a history of a painful search for belonging. I mean, that's kind of one of the things I'm really taking away, and it really kind of reminds me of the work Jake is doing, both in his own kind of search for belonging in his memoir, I Met Myself in October, which is coming out very soon, right, Jake? Yeah. And he'll tell you a little bit more about that. And another wonderful project about histories of adoption of Colombians who have been adopted in other countries. And so we were really eager to hear you share more about your intimate understanding of both different forms of belonging, Jake. So I don't know obviously this is an open question for you to kind of enter in whichever way.
Claro, es mucho.
Sí, no tienes que contestar.
Podríamos estar aquí por una hora fácil. No, but yeah, totally. So it's interesting that we touched on language and then into belonging, and that's certainly my case, right? Like, so as an adoptee, growing up in not even Gig Harbor proper, in the very southern tip of the Key Peninsula, very isolated, very like there are no neighborhoods. There's just houses in different parts of the woods.
Yeah.
So growing up with only English, my adopted parents only speak English, and then transitioning into trying to belong to, at first, the Black community here in the Northwest, because I felt like, well, okay, I look in the mirror and I'm not immediately recognizable as a Latino here in the Northwest. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm getting the pressure from peers and from coaches. I had coaches in high school get angry with me because I wasn't trying out for the basketball and the football teams. I was choosing soccer, and so they thought that my track coach, not my track coach, the track coach told me that I was turning my back on my people by choosing soccer.
Wow.
And I was like, well, he doesn't really realize that I'm not from here, but I am, and it's really interesting. But fast forwarding that to trying to get into conversations with the Black community here, and then being kind of shunned away and having people tell me, you're not Black enough. And I was like, wow, that's okay. What does it mean to be, when do I qualify? When do I get that golden ticket? So, yes, okay, I made it, I'm Black.
Yeah.
How does that happen? And then, okay, well, if I'm not Black, then okay, well, I'm born in Colombia, so maybe I should go and talk to some the Latino students. And so then I did that, like, no, man, you don't speak Spanish. So again, didn't qualify. Like, well, okay, I'll hang out with the Koreans. That's what I did throughout. So like this question of belonging came with the language. I felt like, well, okay, now I really need to be able to speak Spanish to be able to say finally to myself and then to others, to myself first, that I belong as a Colombian. Either it's a Colombian immigrant or if it's a Colombian adoptee. Then we have questions about, do adoptees qualify as immigrants? Yes or no? Why not? Right? And then the trips back to Colombia kind of solidified that, and the search for my biological mother and her family. The memoir, as you said, the title, Adela, is I Met Myself in October, and the subtitle is A Memoir of Belonging. So it's really, I try to go in depth with my own personal journey about how to unpack and kind of navigate that process with the language, to be able to use the language as a key to unlock the door to my biological family. And so I came across I found my biological mother, and then but I couldn't have done that without the language. And so that is just a clear example of the language as the tool to be able to belong. And then even then, after meeting them, it still took a long time to because I had the linguistic piece, but then the cultural piece had to follow, right? So it's just multiple trips going back down there, and to try to understand their lives, and then for them to also understand me, and this supreme privilege that they saw me coming into the country on a plane by myself, and the assumptions that are associated with that, especially the financial assumptions that come with that. So just kind of grappling with that. The memoir is about that, and talks about the search for the biological mother and her family, and then also the biological father who doesn't know I exist. So that's where we're at now. But yeah, there's a lot there.
That's beautiful. I think it's a wonderful intersection of immigration, of race, and where you are at today, and how, like, struggling to find that identity. Like, how do I come across it in a soul search, really, in the Northwest?
Right.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And enoughness. Like, what is enough? Like, I think we struggle. A lot of us in the Latinx community struggle with that. Is like, what is enough? And it's in the United States, because there's a lot of, if you don't speak Spanish, then you're not enough. If you don't look like this, you're not enough. Yeah. Wow. That was.
Yeah. There is so much there, and the question you posed, which I mean, this is something I'll have to think about for a long time. The question of adoption, and immigration is just, because I've been thinking about adoption in relation to colonialism, and something I'm doing right now, and how I think for me, one of the incredible things about being Latinx and Latin American is that you grow up at, whether you discover it when you did, like a little bit later in life, or whether that's where you grew up, really with a wealth of cultures that are just part of who you are and how you think, and you don't necessarily always question, like, does this belong to me? Like, the question of appropriation for me has always been really like, I have a visceral reaction to it, partly because I feel like it's such a misconstruction of what culture is, especially when you come from Latin American and Latinx cultures, where we share, we borrow, we adopt a lot. I mean, it's just part of our history, and part because of a very painful colonial past, but that there is this kind of fluidity in our cultures that allows you to do this kind of adoption of others, and to be adopted into other cultures without really questioning or feeling like you're stealing something.
Right.
But when you juxtapose it to immigration, I feel like that opens up a whole other array of questions that I mean, I have no answers for right now, obviously. I just wanted to really highlight that. And I see Giovanna kind of agreeing with this. I don't know what you'd like to share, Giovanna, anything or?
No, that's a very provocative question that I think people need to start thinking about. Scholarly wise, I would say I haven't seen anything done in that regard. I'm not saying there's no research done on the topic, but if there is, it's a really understudied topic. Yeah. So it provokes us to think also, in a specific context like what it was, the genocide in Guatemala, with so many kids being adopted now by U.S. couples who didn't know those families were actually not given those kids in adoption. But that's taking us now into so I'm going to stop right there. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's something that really needs to be thought of and reflected upon.
I'll go ahead and say as well that these will also be linked in the description. So for y'all to get a link to Jacob's memoir, I Met Myself in October, click the link below and you can see a little bit more about that and order the book online. I encourage y'all to check that out, read it. He's also in a piece of Resolute, which is our local magazine from PLU. So he's highlighted there as well. Got to shout out that. So those will be linked in the bio as well. So you can check it out and get some extra readings after you finish seeing the video.
Yes.
I think we'll go ahead and transition to our last piece. So if you want to introduce Adela.
Sure. So we're ending all our episodes by asking our guests to share, and we've been talking about language so much today that I'm really excited about hearing your words with la palabra del día o la frase del día. So a phrase or a word that is either dear to you or just interesting to you because of its kind of the challenges it poses when you want to translate it or explain it to a friend who might not know it. So I'll let whoever one of you wants to start.
Yeah, I can go first. I included, I think I thought of two things. One was from English into expressions or terms that didn't really translate well, or that I don't feel totally comfortable when I'm using those in different languages. So the expression to be caring in English, for me, it's always hard to translate into Spanish because to be caring, yes, care is cuidado. You can be cuidadoso or cuidadosa or cuidadosex, I guess. We make it inclusive too. But to be cuidadoso is more like to be careful when we translate that back into English. And so there is something lost in translation no matter what with that to be caring. But it is an expression that I really like in English. Like when I go back and I want to talk to friends in Uruguay, I feel the need to use it. I struggle these days about finding an exact translation. And then in Spanish, well, in Uruguay, I think it exists in other parts, but I'm not positive. Pavote y pavota were terms that I grew up using and hearing. I don't know if you've heard that. Do they use it in Mexico? No. What about Colombia, Jake? No? So the equivalent would be silly, but also dumb. It's a playful term. It's not an insult. And I'm not saying that because I used it to others. I was called that too many times. It's really something that you would say as a child or as a teenager or as an adult. So there's no difference in terms of generations. Everybody would use it. When you say it, you are kind of embarrassed and maybe you were put on the spot for something and you would just react to that saying, no seas pavota. And it's like a plea for leave me alone at the same time. It's all those things. So yes, in English you could say don't be silly, but it's not exactly the same thing. So those are my examples.
I think the word maybe I grew up with like a tonto, like a tontito or something.
Baboso. It reminds me of baboso.
Oh, baboso for me it's something totally different.
Totally different.
So don't get into that. That would be really, it would be referring to men who are not being correct in their treatment of others.
Okay.
Mostly women and mostly young women.
Oh, we'll stop there then.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
But see, language is so rich and diverse in the continent as well.
The regional differences are crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it really obviously that in retrospect, it's always like funny to remember when you said something that was actually really vulgar or insulting without knowing, because of where you learned Spanish. But in the moment, it's horrifying because, you know, it's that moment where you're trying to enter a culture and suddenly you say something where people, I mean, usually they laugh and kind of tell you, no, like.
Or not. I made a big mistake in Mexico City many, many years ago when I used the term bárbaros to just agree to paying something for books at a bookstore. And bárbaro in Uruguay and Argentina means, oh, good, cool.
Yeah.
But the person, you know, felt insulted. He thought I was calling him a barbarian. So it was an interesting moment. And then there was a friend of mine right behind me from Argentina who didn't hear the conversation because I immediately explained, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean anything negative by it, right? My friend comes and says exactly the same thing. And so that made it even worse because then this person thought we were actually really making fun of him or insult. So yeah, it's dangerous. Diversity in language can be dangerous sometimes.
Absolutely.
Exciting, but dangerous.
I think we'll go ahead and pass it to Jake next. So Jake, if you want to introduce your word and explain what it means.
Yeah. So my word, I was thinking just now, I was like, oh no, maybe I should change it to this. I have this quote from Eduardo Galeano that I love. But I'm going to go with my original plan, which is one word. It's chévere. And so a lot of people who are watching probably know it as kind of cool, magnificent, amazing. But the origins go back a long ways, and they actually have sub-Saharan African roots. Chévere, if you look at the word, it's repeated with the E a lot of times, and this is a very typical Bantu linguistic pattern.
Wow.
And also, when it was first kind of introduced, it was in Cuba, in Afro-Cuban circles, spelled with a B, not a V, and to mean someone who's brave and someone who's really like on top of their game, kind of, but also brave and yeah, valiente would be brave, right? Yeah. So you'd have to look. Those who are interested, go and check out the Abacua in Afro-Cuban history, and you'll find the origins of chévere. Now we use it all over Latin America as something to mean, yeah, cool, great, fantastic, but it has another connotation, and so it has evolved, of course, like Giovanna was saying, it's the language evolving, but and it's something we use a lot in Colombia. So yeah.
That's fantastic, because I mean, I grew up hearing that word. It's not it's not common in Mexico, but it's very much associated with Colombia for sure.
Yeah.
And I had no idea, of course. And now that you've explained it, it makes perfect sense that that's its origin. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Just do my job.
Well, wonderful job, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to highlight that Jake came down from Seattle, and he had other meetings, and he still made time for us here in Tacoma. So thank you so much. We hope we can invite both of you back to continue all of these amazing discussions that you've opened up for us. And Luke, do you want to remind our audience about all the resources that we're going to be sharing with them?
Yeah, so like I said, we'll have the pieces of from Jacob and Resolute, and I Met Myself in October's memoir. And then I think we're also going to post a little bit of some resources about like the Latinx piece. So you can read a little bit more about like where does that come from, how does it used, what is the current language around it, everything, because it is very much like a contemporary term. Yeah. Anything else, or anything else to include in that resource piece for you?
We also have a link to very recent discussions from United We Dream on anti-Blackness and how to address it with your family, how to understand it, and make sure that you can have those conversations that, as Jake was saying, was really, really urgent, a really urgent question. So that and a lot of other really great resources that Giovanna very kindly collected for us. So you can find those in the bio section for this episode.
And some of those resources were shared by Marisol Espinosa, who is an alum who graduated 2 years ago and lives in Oregon. So thank you to Marisol.
Yes, thank you, Marisol. Thank you. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone so much. Mil gracias.
No, gracias a ustedes.
Gracias a ustedes.
Take care. Cuídense mucho.
Ustedes también.
See you next week with, we're going to be talking about family, community and individuality. And we'll have a special student guest with us. So we're excited about that, and we'll send more details of it later this week.
We will be watching.
Yes. Awesome.